Hi, everyone. George, so wonderful to be here with you. How are you doing?
Yeah, all right, thanks,
Yeah.
despite everything, not because.
So, listen, we have this incredible series of books, and I can't help but notice Greta Thunberg, who is the youngest author in this series. I know that you've worked with her. How does it feel? You have dedicated your entire life, really, you told me earlier, 36 years to environmental and political activism, but the last few years have shown an extraordinary momentum around this issue. How has it felt to watch that momentum build?
Yeah, I do feel that at last it's happening. You know, to be honest, for about 33 years of my working life, I was beating my head against a brick wall, you know, saying, why isn't everyone seeing this? You know, we're talking about our life support systems here. You know, we're talking about the thing without which we can't survive. You know, if we don't have our life support systems, there's nothing. We might as well be living on a barren planet and we can't support ourselves. And yet, it's like they came last all the time. You know, people would talk about the economy, they'd talk about politics, they'd talk about shopping, they'd talk about celebrity, they'd talk about sex, they'd talk about cake. I mean, cake, you know, cake, it's still the case that in a study of 2020 done by a group called Albert, who you know, a media research group, they found that in British TV in 2020, cake was said 10 times more than climate change, right? Banana bread was mentioned more than wind power and solar power put together, and Scotch eggs had twice as many mentions as biodiversity. And this is an improvement. You know, seriously, this is a lot better than it was throughout all those other years of me beating my head against a brick wall. I mean, I'm still beating my head against a brick wall. There's a few little cracks in it. Head's all right, but there's a few little cracks in the wall. But it's like, even now, thanks to the youth movement, when, you know, people are talking about it, thinking about it, within the media, and I think society in general, there's this massive focus on trivia, right? And the really huge issues, these enormous things, the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, in all its different aspects, because it's much more than just climate, you know, there's loads and loads of converging crises. It's like, let's agree not to talk about them. Let's agree not to talk about the only things which are really, really important, because everything else by comparison to them is unimportant. So along comes Greta, all right? And as you probably all know, you know, just starts like all by herself. You know, this lone protest outside the Swedish parliament, just sitting there with a placard. And then one other person comes and sits down with her, one other girl of about her own age. You know, Greta was 15 at the time, and it just snowballs from there. And, you know, we see this incredibly inspiring movement, Fridays for Future, the school strikes, resonating around the world. At the same time, Extinction Rebellion doing its stuff, mostly in the UK, but also resonating around the world. And now we have lots of really great new groups, largely led by young people, like Green New Deal Rising is a really brilliant one. Yeah. Come along recently, some very inspiring characters there. Yeah. And things have changed, you know, things have really changed, certainly in the way we're discussing stuff. And, you know, Greta, she lit the blue touch paper. She lit the spark.
You mentioned converging crises, and in a way this year, I think more than ever, we saw that, didn't we? The ongoing climate crisis, of course, in the background, hard to ignore now, literally a crisis on our doorstep with the flooding in Germany, and racial injustice, a pandemic. You mentioned part of the issue, I think, over the past few decades is that we haven't considered these as interconnected issues. No. And, you know, the climate and ecological crisis has been spoken about as an environmental issue or a problem of nature. But it's a climate crisis, it's a political crisis as much as an environmental one. Is it changing that we're starting to see it as more interconnected? And why is it so important that we do consider it interconnected?
I mean, I think it's really, really crucial to see it as interconnected, because basically all of these crises come about from exploitation. Is some people exploiting other people and exploiting the planet. And really what we're talking about is the richest people exploiting everyone else. That's primarily how it works, and it's how it's worked for a long time. And the story we're told about our economic system that we call capitalism is, oh, well, people get rich from buying and selling things and from hard work and enterprise. Some people do, but when you look at the really huge fortunes, most of them are basically from stealing, from looting, one way or another. So, a lot of them were set up through looting the colonies, where Britain went abroad, grabbed other nations and basically stole their land and their resources and their people. So, for instance, the British extracted, in today's money, $45 trillion from India. We basically just took $45 trillion. That's what funded the Industrial Revolution. We then used that money to invade other countries and capture them and steal their resources, and so it goes on. We stole human beings on an industrial scale from West Africa, moved them across the Atlantic, and then used them as slaves in the Americas and the Caribbean. And people built their fortunes that way. There's a Native American leader, Guaycapiro Cuauhtémoc, who, or that's what he calls himself, who, not his real name, but anyway, he's worked out that if you were to take the gold and silver stolen from Latin America, primarily by the Spanish and Portuguese conquistadores, the colonists there, and if you were to treat it instead of theft, but as a loan for Europe's development, and it would be charged at standard rates of interest, Europe would now owe Latin America a weight of gold and silver greater than the weight of the planet. And so this is how these huge fortunes have been created, and then they get inherited, and then people buy up rows of houses and charge people inordinate rents to live in those houses, and so it builds and builds, and it's basically a system of exploitation, which is dressed up. There's people employed to make it look like a nice thing, to say, oh yeah, this is all enterprise taking on. It's not enterprise, it's robbery, basically. It's robbery. But also, it's robbery from the living world at the same time, from the rest of the living world. It's not just from other human beings, because it's the forests which have been taken, it's the minerals underneath the forests, it's the fish out of the sea, it's the atmospheric space. The atmosphere has been polluted, the rivers have been polluted. It's this wealth that some people have generated is at everybody else's expense, but also the expense of all other species. But it's also theft from the future. It's current generations taking that money or wealth from future generations because they're burning it up at a rate which can't be sustained. So we leave less and less and less for future generations. I mean, look, if this was about hard work and enterprise, if that's how you got rich, every woman in Africa would be a millionaire, all right? It's so not about hard work and enterprise, absolutely. We've got to use hard work and enterprise. Ideally, not so much to make ourselves rich, but to save the blinking planet now. That's going to take hard work and enterprise, and absolutely, everyone in this room, I want you to work like as hard as you possibly can, and to be as brilliant and clever and innovative as you possibly can. But not to make yourself rich, have a decent life, a comfortable life, but put that effort into the greatest quest humanity has ever faced, which is facing up to this existential crisis of ours, which is the potential collapse of our life support systems. And so, that's how they all interconnect. It's how all the issues interconnect. It's basically a system of theft and exploitation from other people and from the rest of the world. And the same goes with racial exploitation and sexual exploitation. It's powerful people exploiting other people and imposing their will on other people. And so what we're fighting effectively is an exploitation system.
I want to, on that note, read a quote of yours. What economists proclaim as progress, ecologists recognize as... I literally cannot read what I've written. Ruin.
as ruin.
What economists proclaim as progress, ecologists recognize as ruin. So, I mean, what you're talking about is our economic system, which is capitalism. So just taking a step back, why is that system, by its very nature, at odds with the potential for a stable, even a flourishing planet?
Yeah, that's the key question. That is the key question. And so to give just one example, the system depends on growth. If it stops growing, it dies, right? Growth is absolutely fundamental to capitalism. And indeed to wealth accumulation. I mean, capitalism really just exists to help some people concentrate wealth into their own pockets, to capture and accumulate wealth. So and growth is central to this. It's really essential to the model. You know, if growth stops, the system is deemed to have collapsed. So the economy just must keep growing and growing and growing for the economy to survive, right? And if you look at what the global bodies like the World Bank and the IMF say, they say, well, we only want 3% growth a year. Is that too much to us? 3% means a doubling every 24 years. So everything we see today, all the economic activity we see today, which is having such a devastating impact on the living planet, is doubled by 2045. Then 24 years later, 2069, it doubles again. And then 24 years, it just keeps doubling and doubling and doubling. It's like the Gemino curse in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Where they're in the Lestrange vault, right? And the treasure keeps multiplying. And it's multiplying and multiplying so much that it's going to crush them to death. Harry and his friends is going to crush them to death because there's too much treasure just multiplying. That's what economic growth is doing, because while the economy is growing, the world is not. The planet is not growing. The planet stays the same size. It's got the same resources in it, and that it can't accommodate that ever-expanding growth. So even if we take just that aspect of capitalism and of wealth concentration and exploitation, it cannot be sustained. It will destroy everything if it is not stopped. You have to stop the Gemino curse.
We've gone straight into the deep end in this conversation. I want to take, literally. I want to take a step back for a moment and just really interrogate what we mean by climate change, because there's no doubt every single person in this room knows or understands some aspect of climate change. But why is it more than a few degrees of warming? What are the impacts in terms of the societies in which we might live, the governments that may be elected? What will be the impact on our lives of what seems like minute changes in our environment?
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say is I don't call it climate change because it's this weirdly neutral term to use. It's like calling an invading army unexpected visitors. It's just like, I call it climate chaos or climate breakdown, because that's what we're looking at. So basically, the Earth's atmosphere is a complex system. The Earth's oceans are a complex system. The forests, the living part of the world is a complex system. The soils are a complex system. Complex systems behave in particular ways. And one of the ways in which they behave is that they have what are called tipping points. So they've got their own internal dynamics which keep them stable within what's called an equilibrium state. So if, it's a bit like the human body, which is also a complex system, and they all behave in fundamentally the same way. So if you go for a run and you get really hot, all these mechanisms in the body kick in to cool you down, right? And to maintain your temperature at a constant state. So you sweat, you pant, you vasodilate, blood comes to the surface of your skin, you lose that surplus heat to maintain that constant temperature. And it's a miracle. It's an amazing thing. Human body, you can subject it to all sorts of stress and it maintains that temperature. If it gets out of whack, the temperature can start rising, like you have a fever, You're infected by a virus or a bacterium, it can cause a fever, and then it can suddenly start getting completely out of control, your temperature. And it starts spiraling out of control, and it can reach this tipping point, which tips your body into a different state that's called death. Right, so you want to try to avoid that tipping point, and so you have lots of medical interventions to avoid it. But if you get past a certain state, it's really, really hard to bring you back. And the same if you get too cold, if you get hypothermia, you know, there's a certain point above which they can bring you back, but below that point they can't bring you back. You're just going to die. You've reached a tipping point the other way. All complex systems are like this. They can regulate themselves within a certain range of stress. But if you subject them to too much cold or too much heat or too much fever in our case, then they can't regulate themselves anymore. And the internal regulation of that complex system breaks down, and then they'll suddenly flip. Like you go from alive to dead in 1 second. And the atmosphere and the other complex systems in the world, they have their tipping points too, and can suddenly flip from one stable state into another stable state. And death is a pretty stable state. I'm not talking about death in this case, but I'm talking about a stable, self-regulating state which is completely different to the one that they're in now. So, for instance, the Earth becoming more or less uninhabitable, you know, pretty well desert, which is what has happened in the past, 251 million years ago when the Permian period came to an end, largely because of carbon dioxide emissions from the Siberian traps in Eurasia. Lots of CO2 came out of volcanoes in that case. It wasn't produced by people because this was a long time before people. And it wiped out roughly 90% of life on Earth because the world turned to rubble, it turned to desert. The plants all died, the soil then washed off the land, there was nothing to hold it, it was just like rocky rubble, nearly everything got wiped out. And it's because the whole system just flipped from one state to another. So we can't afford to let our system flip. If it flips, we can't flip it back. We're toast. Right, and we don't know where those tipping points are. Because apart from anything else, we're not talking about one system, we're talking about a whole series of interlocking systems. So if you look at one of those interlocking systems, just take it in isolation. Of course, they don't act in isolation, but let's isolate it just to be able to talk about it. It's a system of ocean currents that travels around the world called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation.
Wow, catchy.
They keep these things. They like to keep these things simple. Sorry about that, but we know it as the Gulf Stream.
Okay.
Right, the Gulf Stream is just one part of it, but that's the bit that we know because what it does, this system, is to move heat from the tropics towards the poles, particularly towards the North Pole. Without it, we'd have a climate like Siberia here. Now, this system, the AMOC system, or the Gulf Stream if you want, this is a complex system, right? And it has tipped in the past. The last time it tipped, you won't remember it, was 12,800 years ago. And it suddenly flipped from the on state that it's in at the moment, where it circulates this heat, to the off state. And for around 1,000 years, we had a short, what was called an interstadial, a geological period, a short geological period, very short in geological terms, long in human terms, about 1,000 years, where the world, the northern hemisphere, including Britain, was plunged into deep cold. We went back into the Ice Age. But the tropics became unbelievably hot because the heat wasn't being transferred from them. So that's just one subsystem within all the other systems. But if one system like that flips, it can then cause a cascade of all the other systems flipping at the same time. So we don't have long now. We don't know how long we've got because we don't know how close those tipping points are, but we have to stop them from happening. If we don't stop them from happening, everything's gone. Everything we know and love, everything that allows us to exist is all gone. So this is why it's a huge and urgent task. It's the biggest mission humanity has ever had, and it needs heroes. It doesn't need a handful, it doesn't need one hero, it doesn't need a handful of heroes. It needs billions of heroes in this moment to stop it happening.
in a way, the systems you speak of have been in relative balance. And in fact, there's been a kind of long period of stability that has made everything we know as our current reality possible. And we're going into uncharted territories. We don't really know. As you say, there are tipping points. We don't know exactly when they'll come. But we do know that there's troubled times ahead, and scientists call it sort of untold suffering that could come. You did mention that we are here in the UK, of course, the home of the Industrial Revolution, and in a way, we began this great fossil fuel experiment. What does that mean in terms of our historic responsibility and ongoing responsibility to take action now?
Yeah, it's really huge. It's really, really huge. I mean, unless we lead on this or are among the leaders on this, why should anyone else bother? You know, I'm assailed by trolls every day. You know, anyone on social media will be aware of it, but it's just like I'm just bombarded by trolls. And what they're constantly saying is, why don't you go and protest in China? Because the story is, it's the Chinese doing it. You know, they're trying to sort of transfer responsibility and blame. And, you know, they haven't got any good reason for this. It's just that they don't want to take moral responsibility for what they're doing. But they say, go and protest in China. Look, that's where the emissions are. Well, yeah, China's got a lot of emissions. You know, China needs to sort those out as well. But, you know, 46% of the carbon dioxide we're responsible for is embedded in the stuff we buy, a lot of which comes from China. So who's really responsible for this? Is it the Chinese for making it, or is it us for buying it? You know, we're both responsible for it. You can't transfer responsibility. And yeah, and as for protesting in China, well, you know, I met the Chinese Greta the other day, Howie Orr, who is the most inspiring, amazing young woman, 18-year-old, really a phenomenal character, unbelievably brave. Because, you know, it's one thing to protest in this country, and you do sometimes have to be brave, but protesting in China, geez, you know, getting interrogated by the Chinese authorities. I mean, basically, she's had to flee the country. She's in Britain at the moment.
Wow. Because
it's so hard. But, you know, if an 18-year-old can protest in China, what's our excuse?
Okay, so we've sort of laid the groundwork for the situation that we're in, and I want to move on slightly to what we can all do about it. And I will speak from experience that I've had real moments of feeling really reluctant, I guess, to getting involved and adding my voice to the climate movement, because I am so terrified of being called a hypocrite or being told you don't do enough in your life to justify you speaking on this issue. And I want to read something that you wrote. It says, had we put as much effort into preventing environmental catastrophe as we've spent on making excuses for inaction, we would have solved it by now. Everywhere I look, I see people engaged in furious attempts to fend off the moral challenge it presents. What does that mean? What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so the example I've just given of people saying, why don't you go and protest in China? That's a classic example of this. It's just like fend off the moral challenge, send the issue somewhere else, take it away from me. I don't want to know. I've got my own life to lead. I don't want to know about this. Because it is really challenging. For the reasons I spelt out in the first answer, you know, this is fundamental. This challenges the whole system, not an aspect of the system, not a little thing which we might do. It's not about changing your cotton buds or using fewer plastic bags. This is about everything. This is about the whole way in which we live. And people find that very challenging. And it presses a button, you know, it really presses the red button, and people get very reactive and very angry when you press that button. And so one of the things they'll throw at you is being a hypocrite. Because we're all hypocrites. You know, there's only two kinds of people in the world. There's hypocrites and there's cynics, right? And a hypocrite is someone who's trying to do better but falls short, and a cynic is someone who's not trying to do better. Now, I know which of those two I'd rather be.
Same.
You know, some people think there's a third category called morally pure, but I've never met anyone like that. They don't exist. There's only the two. So, if you wear leather shoes, they call you a hypocrite, right? If you don't wear leather shoes, they call you a hippie, which is like hypocrite, but shorter. And basically, if you're not living in a barrel, subsisting off dirty water, they're not going to listen to you because you're a hypocrite. But if you are living in a barrel, subsisting off dirty water, they're not going to listen to you because you're a weirdo. So the whole idea is that you can't win. That's the point of it. The point is that you can't win. So what I'd say is don't be put off by what people are saying.
There is no such thing as a perfect activist, and as you say, it's much better to have thousands, hundreds of thousands, I mean preferably billions of people doing it imperfectly than a handful doing it perfectly. So when I talk of activism, what do we mean? Because I guess a lot of people might think activism is standing in the street in protest. Of course that is one form, but it means different things to all of us. How would you frame it, and how can everyone in this room in their daily lives become activists?
So I actually had a conversation with Greta about this. She came to my house after we made that film, and we had quite a long chat for a couple of hours. And a big part of the chat was about the different roles that different people play within the movement. And it's like an ecosystem, where you've got you have your lions and you have your wolves and you have your deer and you have your trees and you have your insects and you have your birds. We need lots and lots of different people doing different things, occupying different bits of that food web to make an effective movement. Absolutely you need people in the street, doing the direct action. You also need the thinkers and the writers, people like myself. I do a bit of direct action as well, but it's most of my action involves sitting on my bum at home and writing stuff, researching stuff. But that is a necessary part of it. You need lawyers, you need accountants, you need people handing out leaflets, you need people printing the leaflets. You need people supporting the people who are in the street, providing food for them, whatever it might be. You just need a huge range of people. You need people like you, people like me, people like the person behind the camera, people like the people in the sound booth, people like you lot listening. You need this huge, wide range of people using their specialist skills. So this is why I say hard work and enterprise, absolutely. Really dedicate ourselves, but dedicate it to this higher purpose, which is getting us out of the death spiral, which we'd otherwise be in.
You're very modest to say you sit on your bum and write, but of course a massive part of what you're doing is storytelling. And it really can't be overstated how important stories are, right?
Yeah.
Because they allow us to dare to imagine a different way of doing things. And I think it's probably fair to say we have a bit of a failure of a collective vision right now. We don't know, we might be aware that we live in broken systems this year more than any, but we don't feel we really know what the alternative might be. No. So what is the role in storytelling?
Yeah, so storytelling is really fundamental. I mean, it's really fundamental because we are creatures of narrative. We understand the world through stories because the world is otherwise too complicated.
Right.
It is incredibly complex. I was talking about complex systems. There's complex system layered upon complex system upon complex system upon complex system. And as you say, they're ones which human beings create, like the world financial system, like the IT system, the global IT system, which is, again, systems within systems. Like each single one of us is a complex system, like human society is a complex system. There's so many. We can't understand all that. So we use shortcuts, and a story is a shortcut. And for a story to work in political terms, in terms of activism, it has to tell you where you are and how you got there, and then where you're going to go and how you're going to do it. And what we find in politics, and this has been the case now for at least a couple of thousand years and probably for longer, there's a particular narrative structure which works. Now there's some argument amongst literary types about how many basic plots there are. There's how many basic narrative structures, ways of telling a story. And some people say there's 3, and some people say there's 5, and some people say there's 7, and some people say there's 9. It's always an odd number for some reason. Sounds grander if it's an odd number. But there's one of those basic plots, one of those narrative frameworks, which works in politics, and that's the one I call the restoration story. And so the framework goes like this. It says, the world has been thrown into disorder by powerful and nefarious forces working against the interests of humanity. But the hero or heroes confronts those powerful forces, overthrows them, and restores harmony to the land. That is the framework. And you'll be very familiar with this because, you know, it's a story you'll hear again and again. It's the Dark Materials story, it's the Harry Potter story, it's the Bible story, it's a Narnia story. It's a very familiar story. It's not the only framework, but it's the one that works in politics. So what you've got to do to be effective in politics is say, right, the world's been thrown into disorder. What is the disorder it's been thrown into? So in this case, we could be talking about climate breakdown. Who are the powerful and nefarious forces who have thrown it into that disorder? Well, we'd say the fossil fuel companies and the banks and others who have supported them. Who are the heroes who are going to confront these powerful and nefarious forces? Well, I think there might be some in this room today. I hope so. And how are they going to confront them? Well, through protest, through activism. And against the odds, they're going to overthrow them, because that's an essential part. That's the sort of crux of the story. That's the tipping point of the story, if you like, or the volta, as they say in drama. The point at which the story flips, where against the odds, the heroes overthrow the powerful and nefarious forces. So how are we going to do this? Well, we do it by building worldwide effective movements and constantly innovating and bringing in new tactics and bringing in new ways of getting this to the front of people's minds. And in doing so, we restore harmony to the land. And that means a stable climate and a stable ecosystem which continues to support us and the rest of life on Earth.
In one way, I mean, just to go back to the beginning of the conversation, all these issues are interconnected, and yes, it's incredibly complicated, as you've said. It's often extremely overwhelming because you don't know where to start. But you could also turn that on its head and see it as an opportunity, because in trying to tackle the climate crisis, you can also try and address the root of some of these issues. Do we spend enough time speaking about the opportunity rather than just the sacrifices? You know, we're told all the time, and of course it's true, we have to change our lifestyles. We have to consume less, ultimately. But do we speak about what there is to gain, the future world that could be fairer, greener, and better, that is so incredibly worth all of us fighting for? Why don't we speak about that more?
I know, it's so important, because it's not like we're living in the perfect circumstance at the moment, is it? I mean, there's so much wealth in the world, but so many people in poverty. 800 million people who are permanently malnourished. Actually, if you look at people with micronutrient deficiencies, it's like over 2 billion. In this world of plenty. In this world which has got so much food that we feed half of it to animals, feed it to livestock, and then we eat the livestock. You know, it's just this ridiculous profligacy, this abundance, and yet people go hungry in this world because of inequality, because some people have got all the money and other people haven't. And, you know, we live often lives which are pretty miserable. You know, you had to do jobs you don't want to do, and you get paid rubbish for them, and you live in a place you don't want to live, and it's got water running down the walls, and it's crowded, and you're being charged massive rent for it, and all the rest of it. And it's like, well, why? Why do we have to live like that? And the fact is, we don't. We absolutely don't. We accept this system because there's a kink in the human brain. There's something wrong with us. And what's wrong with us is the obedience instinct. Now, I had to be careful talking about this in a school. I recognize that. But, yeah, so I'm not saying that disobedience is always in itself a good thing. But I'm saying that the obedience instinct all too often overrides our survival instinct and a whole lot of other good instincts. That people will do things because other people are telling them to do it and because they feel they have to, but they know those things are wrong. And they know those things are harming the world and harming other people. So why do they do it? And it's because this obedience instinct often will override, even in the most immediate circumstance, the survival instinct. There's this wonderful book by Vasily Grossman called Life and Fate. I think it could be the greatest Russian novel ever. That's saying a lot because there's been some amazing Russian novels. It's a truly amazing book. And he lived through it. You know, he lived through Stalin. He lived through Nazi occupation of part of Russia. He was a Jewish man, and he was a refusenik, so he was someone persecuted by Stalin as well as by the Nazis. It was, you know, he really lived it. And he said, you know, what this has showed is people's willingness to obey the most outrageous things. So people, he said, would form queues to be executed, and they would regulate those queues, and they would queue all day long waiting to be executed, and they would say, no, this is my place in the queue. They would stop anyone cutting in ahead of them and queue like they were queuing for the shops. They would queue to be executed. And he's saying, what's going on here? What is it that's happening? And he said, this is obedience kicking in. See, obedience is too strong, and it's stronger than our survival instinct. And this is the case with this system. So, you know, this system I described, which is basically a system of exploitation, why do we go along with it? You know, why do we accept this system? Well, it's partly that we think the finger's going to point at us next. We're going to be the next millionaire. Yeah, maybe some people will, but very few people, because it depends on there being a small number of rich people and a large number of poor people who the rich people exploit. And eventually, you know, if we carry on with this system, no one's going to be a millionaire, no one's going to have anything at all because we're going to wipe out our life support systems. It's part of the reason, but the other part of the reason is we're obedient. We do what we're told. Oh, that's a powerful person saying it, so I've got to do it. Without questioning why. Why do I have to do this? So, you know, what Greta did was a phenomenally brilliant act of disobedience. She didn't go to school. Now, again, I'm not, you know, I know I've got to be careful here, but you know, for a good reason, you know, not for a selfish reason. She didn't go to school because she thought there was something else even more important than school. And you know, I accept and Greta accepts that school is really important. But here was something even more important, and she could see it because she had a different way of looking at the world. She was seeing what other people weren't seeing, and she was seeing what was real that other people weren't seeing. And because she could see it, she refused to obey. In the immediate sense, she refused to obey the teachers at school who said, you've got to go to school. And in fact, there's some film footage of her on the very first day. I know the filmmaker who made it, where, you know, she's there by herself with her thing, and this lady walks up to her and says, what are you doing? And she says, I'm doing a school show. You should be at school, young lady. And she really starts berating her, you know, and really having a go at her. And Greta just very calmly says, well, no, I think I should be here, and this is why. So the disobedience continues. And what she was committing was what we call an act of civil disobedience, like the suffragettes did, like the civil rights campaigners did. They used civil disobedience as a very powerful political tool. But it's more than just a tool, it's a state of mind. You cease to obey. You cease to obey the system which is pushing us towards disaster. And that is the crucial thing we need to do.
On that note, let us question the status quo and challenge, as you say, the systems that govern us. I think we'll turn over to questions now. So please don't be shy. Brilliant. There's a mic on its way to you.
George, you mentioned the system, capitalism, I'm assuming you're talking about, right? And you're talking about the individuals who have wealth. So say in a world we give this wealth to everyone. See, that's a conversation, there's no answer. So what do these people do with that wealth? You can give them the tools, but you know, they're not gonna farm, you know, that's like the analogy. So is it really like, it's very simplistic to see it as just giving wealth away. You know, we have to start an idea, but where does that idea come from? You know, not just giving people money, you know, you're giving them money, you're giving them the same thing to consume. So is it problematic, which I believe it is, just to give money away and no instructions, because money is the route to consumption, which you mentioned is a route to climate change. So that's my question.
Thank you very much. No, thanks. Very good question. So by wealth, I'm not just talking about money. So we could look at natural wealth, for example, look at land, you know, because you mentioned the issue of farming. And what we've seen in recent years has been a massive grabbing of land. It's a sort of continuation of colonialism by other means. Rich people from all over the world going primarily to African countries, but also in Asia and Latin America, and taking people's land and effectively stealing it because they just do a corrupt deal with the local government and they say, oh yeah, you can have the land. And they kick everyone off that land and they concentrate that land into their own hands. And that's the concentration of wealth. Now, by and large, the small farmers working on that land tended to be working in more environmentally friendly ways than the people who grab it, because the people who grab it, they don't care about the land. They just want to get money from it as quickly as possible, so they grow what's called flex crops, crops which could be used either for human food or for animal feed or for biofuel. They don't care, but they just grow them on a huge scale, ploughing up everything, tearing down all the trees, burning everything, and often with absolutely catastrophic environmental consequences. So we can see just by that concentration of wealth, we see environmental disaster accompanied by massive social disaster, because those people who were living on the land before, now they've got nothing. And they'll end up in a shanty town with no means of making a living, or very poor means of making a living, in a tiny, cramped room without basic facilities. So they've lost a huge amount there. And really, to a large extent, when I'm talking about wealth, and I say wealth rather than capital, what I'm talking about is natural wealth. It's the division of natural wealth. And I've got a principle which I feel is the basis for the system that I want to see, which is what I call private sufficiency, public luxury. That we should all have our own domain. You know, we could have our own home with our own stuff in it, but not very much, you know, enough, but not very much. But if we want to spread our wings, if we want luxury, we seek it in the public domain, not private luxury. Because there's simply, physically, not even enough space for everyone to have luxury. If everyone in London had their own swimming pool and their own tennis court and their own big garden and play equipment for the kids and their own art collection and stuff, London would cover half of England. Right? England would cover most of Europe. Europe would cover the whole world. There's physically not enough space for it. And some people can have private luxury only because other people don't. But we can all have public luxury. We can all have fantastic public parks and public swimming pools and public tennis courts and public transport and public health systems and public museums and community centres and youth clubs and playgrounds and all the rest of it. We could all have that without taking anything away from anyone else. By sharing the wealth, and this is what I mean mainly by sharing the wealth, it's not giving money away, but actually saying, here is something we can all enjoy at the same time without taking it away from each other. By sharing wealth, we create more physical space and more ecological space for everyone.
Yes, question right at the back.
I wanted to ask, wouldn't you say that's a bit idealistic, especially when people in this world have their own problems and it's like they're very selfish, and isn't it coming down to like teaching empathy and things like that?
Thank you. Another very good question. Yeah, it is very idealistic. You know, if we can't be idealistic, we're stuffed, basically. You know, our hopes rely on being idealistic, because the opposite is to be cynical. The opposite is just to say, well, it is what it is. What can we do? Shrug our shoulders. We've just got to get on with it. You know, that is the track we're on. It's called business as usual. That is the road which leads us straight to the cliff edge, right? So we have to be like Greta. We have to be idealistic. We have to say, you know, we have to see another way of doing this. Now, as for the claim that everyone's selfish, it's true, we all have some selfishness in us. We all have a bit. We all have some greed in us. But in the great majority of people, and I'm not just talking off the top of my head here, this is, you know, there's some really solid social science and psychology showing this. The great majority of people, those are not our dominant values. Our dominant values are actually empathy and altruism and a need for belonging. These are our dominant values. These are the things that are most important to us. Otherwise, how would it be? How would you treat each other? If your dominant values were selfishness and greed, what would it look like right now? You'd be stealing each other's phones. You'd be literally the toughest, strongest people here would be beating the crap out of everybody else in order to steal their stuff. Now that might happen a little bit, but is that the universal rule in this school? Is that how it usually happens? Is that how you usually interact with each other? Yeah, no, don't answer that. No, you make a bit of space for each other, don't you? You know, you actually, you know, respect each other's space, respect each other's belongings, respect each other's feelings, at least to some extent. Some do it better than others, we all know that. But you do it at least to some extent, and that's because selfishness and greed are not our dominant values. We're the most cooperative species which has ever existed in the mammalian kingdom, with the possible exception of the naked mole rat. Right? But apart from naked mole rats, there's no greater cooperative mammal than the human being. And yet the story we're constantly told is we're selfish and greedy. By people who want us to be selfish and greedy. By people who are selfish and greedy and want us to be like them. And the tragedy, the human tragedy, is that we're a society of altruists governed by psychopaths. Because the people who rule us, they're not like us. There's been, again, some very strong psychological work showing that the people in the most dominant positions tend to be very different psychologically to the great majority of people. They're people like Donald Trump, who's all about me. It's all about bigging myself up, about building this enormous gold tower with my name on it. You know, and it's all about selfishness and greed. Yeah, but that is not how most people are. Unfortunately, we keep allowing people like that to come on top and dominate the rest of us. So that's where the idealism comes in. That's where we say, yeah, actually, let's be idealistic about this and let's not be governed by people like that. Let's be governed by people like us. Let's create systems, democratic systems, which are run by people like us. People who are altruistic, who are empathetic. Is that too much to ask? Is that a ridiculous thing when the great majority of us are altruistic and empathetic? I don't think so.
Yes, up at the back.
So you mentioned how we are empathetic, and I'm curious to know, if we carry on like this, do you feel like we might end up losing that sort of thing within us humans by being ruled by people who lack that and are selfish? And what are some of the consequences you may feel would come from that?
Thank you. Yes, another excellent question. I mean, the fact is that, you know, we've been through hell many, many times before. You know, you look at the way that the selfish and greedy people have exploited other people, be it slavery, be it colonialism, be it the exploitation of women, which for the great majority of modern history has been horrendous. You know, women exploited by men, the exploitation of children. And yet, throughout all that, the majority of people have not lost their empathy and altruism. They still help each other to survive those horrendous situations. You know, even in the midst of the most terrible things done by people, the Holocaust, the Holodomor, Stalin's mass killing of people, even then people helped each other, people looked out for each other, people supported each other. And we see in the midst of terrible crises, people continue to support each other. So I don't think we lose those basic human capacities. I think they can be suppressed, you know, we can become more obedient, even more obedient than we are. And, you know, what Vasily Grossman says in this book, Life and Fate, is that, you know, under totalitarian regimes, this obedience becomes a really big, strong thing, and that can stifle our other instincts. But those instincts don't go away. They're stifled, they're suppressed, but they don't go. But what you're touching on is really profound. You know, this is a really fundamental thing. You know, how do we remain the good people that we are? How do we remain true to our good nature in extreme circumstances? And, you know, part of the answer to the question is, well, you know, we shouldn't let the circumstances get too extreme. You know, we must constantly fight for that better world, to not allow ourselves to be pushed into that disaster. But another part is, you know, always find that good in yourself and find that good in other people, because in the great majority of people it's there. You know, don't judge us by those who lead us, because those who lead us are really not like us.
Okay, one last question.
You talk about capitalism being the problem, but what is an alternative to capitalism that we can use? Because many systems, like communism, is corrupted by those minority that wish for us to be selfish.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Communism was an absolute catastrophe. And it was ecologically a catastrophe as well as socially. You know, I mean, it was terrible for people, terrible for the living world as well. And that's absolutely not the way I want to go. So I would start by this notion of private sufficiency, public luxury, you know, that we create our big wealth in the public sphere, not in the private sphere. So straight away you can see you've got a system which has got different elements in it. You know, there's things we do entirely in our own right, among ourselves, among our families, and those remain our own thing, but you know, there's also stuff that we share. But I would marry that to a system of political change where you have far more power among yourselves. So at the moment, we've got this, I mean, the political system we've got at the moment is just crazy. It's really, really crazy. We call it democracy, right? But what happens in this system? Well, every 5 years you put a cross on a piece of paper if you're over 18, right? You put a cross on a piece of paper. And then the person who gets the most crosses say, right, I can form the government, right? Even if it's not even a majority of the population. It could just be a really quite small part of the population gave them those crosses, but we got more than those other people. We got more crosses than them. So for the next 5 years, me who's forming this government, I can do what I want. Any policy I can get through Parliament, that is my writ. And whether it's in the manifesto, which I published, which no one ever read anyway, because who reads the manifesto, or whether it's not, I can push that policy through. And if someone says, well, I didn't vote for that, you say, no, you voted for me, and so therefore you are presumed to have consented to everything I do for the next 5 years, regardless of what it is. Presumed consent, that's the basis of the system. Now, we do not accept the principle of presumed consent in sex. Why should we accept it in politics? It's fundamentally wrong. It is obscene that we should have a system where our consent for everything that the government does is presumed for the full 5 years. Because most people, most of the time, wouldn't agree with what a particular government is doing. And this is a really old-fashioned system. It's a system developed in the age of the quill pen and the horse-drawn carriage. But now we have all these digital tools for refining our choices, for actually having almost day-to-day control over our lives, for questions being put to people as locally as possible, saying, what do you actually want? Do you want this or do you want that? Or why don't you put forward your ideas and let's vote on your ideas? And there's some places in the world where they're doing this. Reykjavik in Iceland, for example, they have this scheme called Better Reykjavik, and every month the citizens put forward ideas and everybody else votes on those ideas. And the ones which get the most votes get put before the council, and they either have to accept the policy or come up with a really good reason for rejecting it. The same going on in Madrid now, with Decide Madrid. In the Brazilian city of Porto Alegre, they have participatory budgeting, where every year the people of the city set the budget and decide how the money is going to be spent. They don't leave it to the politicians to decide, the people decide. And they can do all this with the help of our new digital tools, with the help of IT. Why aren't we all doing this? Why don't we all live this way? That's what democracy looks like. Not 600 people sitting in Westminster saying, will the honourable member please stand down, blah, blah, blah. That's not us. That's not us talking. That's not our power being felt. That's their power being imposed on us. It's time to turn that round and for us to become the powerful people. So we have an economic change, but the political change goes with it. Participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, going alongside private sufficiency and public luxury. So that's the new system. It hasn't got a name yet, but if you want to give it one, comments are open. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is my mic on?
Hello.
I think that's a very important note to end on. We are powerful, and I certainly know from my experience that thinking about climate change, it feels so overwhelming. You can feel powerless, but we can do so much in our own lives. Let's be idealistic. Let's dream up different ways of doing things. Thank you so much, George, for being here. So grateful.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.